The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the desert like golden threads slowly fading in color. The sun hung low at the horizon's edge, dyeing the entire landscape with the burning orange hues of a western sunset. The wind blew gently, sweeping over cacti and arid plains, carrying the scent of dust and long untouched dry leaves. This land was barren not only by nature, but also by the countless untold stories. It was a land of fugitives, seekers, and sometimes lost souls who had forgotten their way. Red sandstone, baked under the sun day after day for centuries, formed natural towers that rose like silent sentinels guarding the wild frontier. On the old, worn trail, where wagon wheel tracks from bygone days had faded with time, a solitary figure on horseback appeared, as if stepping out from the very memory of this land. The horse bore a reddish-brown coat like clay burned under the sun, its footsteps resonating with a steady, deep rumble. Its name was Robin, the unwavering, loyal companion of the rider. Robin was no ordinary horse. Its deep brown eyes reflected what they had witnessed: chases across deserts, cold nights under the stars, and battles where gunfire drowned out the wind. Robin's long chestnut mane, curling slightly in the evening breeze, and the strong jawbone visible beneath taut skin displayed rare strength and endurance. According to those who had seen it gallop, Robin could outrun the wind across the Utah plains. The man needed no introduction. No greeting was necessary. One look at his worn cowboy hat, his long shadow cast upon the speckled ground in the fading light, and everyone understood. He had traveled far and witnessed things others dared not imagine. They called him Chuck Norris, the man who walked through windstorms as if strolling through a park. Red dust covered Chuck's worn brown leather boots, the cracks in the leather telling stories of long journeys. His faded jeans were held up by a leather belt with a silver buckle engraved with a bull's head, a gift from an old friend in Texas who was no longer in this world. A light blue checkered shirt peeked out from beneath a dark brown leather jacket, old but durable, bearing small scratches like marks of unforgettable battles. And on his sun-weathered face, deep wrinkles were etched not by age, but by how time had treated him. Chuck was not a man of many words. He had learned silence from the desert, a place that speaks only when necessary. His deep, sea-green eyes beneath the black cowboy hat brim observed everything with an unsettling stillness. His beard was short, neatly trimmed, and flecked with a few silver strands, signs of age but not of weakness. The small town gradually appeared in the brilliant evening light, a scattered collection of old wooden houses, paint peeling, windows rattling in the wind. Dust Creek wasn't a destination. It was where people stopped along their journey. Perhaps that's why it still existed after all these years, when other gold mining towns had vanished with time like mirages in the desert. On a rusty iron sign hanging askew by the road, a few words were still legible enough to read the welcome message. Welcome to Dust Creek, where the wind remembers everything. Below the sign, a smaller plaque read, Population 127 souls. No one knew when the word souls had been added, but it accurately reflected the essence of Dust Creek, a town where the past always haunted the present. The main street had just one row of buildings on each side, a general store with a brass bell turned green with verdigris, a small sheriff's office with a rocking chair on the porch, a barber shop and horse stable side by side, and, finally, a saloon that doubled as a diner, where all stories flowed like water to the sea. At the center of town stood an old establishment that still retained its original L. The rusted spit's slanted tile roof, weathered wooden dew and metal sign swaying in the wind like an ancient bell heralding time flowing backward. Oil lamps had been lit inside, casting warm, flickering light. As Chuck entered the town, a few residents standing on their porches observed him with curious yet cautious eyes. A stranger in Dust Creek was unusual, and a stranger on horseback even rarer. An old man, sitting in a rocking chair on his porch, touched the brim of his hat in greeting, a rare gesture of respect reserved for those who honored the old ways. Chuck dismounted. He tied Robin to the wooden post in front of the diner. Not too tight, just enough so the horse could lower its head to chew some dry grass growing between the cracked paving stones. Robin showed no fear. It stood still, eyes gazing into the distance as if it too had been a warrior. He gently stroked Robin's mane, whispering words only the horse could hear, then took a brown sugar cube from his jacket pocket and placed it in his palm. Robin carefully took it, chewing slowly. This was not the first time they had performed this ritual. Robin's ears twitched slightly, listening to the wind and other sounds that human ears couldn't detect. Chuck brushed the dust from his jacket, adjusted his hat brim, and walked slowly toward the entrance. The wooden door opened with a dry, creaking sound, a musical prelude to a story whose ending no one yet knew. The air inside was thick with the aroma of strong coffee, stale tobacco smoke, and cooking oil long overdue for changing. The rusted spur was Dust Creek's lifeblood, where news was shared, deals were made, and secrets were kept. The place had just a few patrons. An old truck driver hunched over a coffee cup, a young man in a baseball cap reading a newspaper, and a waitress standing behind the counter, polishing a glass as if she were polishing away a long, tiring day. The waitress, Elizabeth, or Lizzie as everyone called her, was the only person under 40 in the diner. Her reddish-brown hair was tied back neatly, her green eyes brightening when she saw the stranger enter. Lizzie had lived her entire life in Dust Creek, but had never stopped dreaming of distant lands she had only read about in books. "A stranger," she said softly, just loud enough for the young man to look up from his paper. He, Sam Williams, son of the retired sheriff, looked at Chuck with curious yet wary eyes. Sam had left Dust Creek to study in Phoenix, but had returned 6 months ago after his father passed away to take over the small ranch on the edge of town. Chuck sat down near the window, a spot where he could drink coffee while keeping an eye on the main street and Robin. "Black coffee," he said. That was all. The waitress nodded, asking nothing more. Inside the diner, everyone seemed to sense that he wasn't a man for small talk, just a man for observation. Lizzie poured coffee from a thick glass pot, steam rising to form a thin mist around her face. She placed the coffee cup on a small white porcelain saucer, one of the few items in the diner that still retained its pristine appearance. The coffee was placed on the table. Chuck took it with his calloused hands. The warm sensation seeping through his skin reminded him he was still alive. He took a sip. Bitter, strong. Perfect for a man who had tasted hundreds of more bitter things in life. The old truck driver, the only one who dared break the silence, cleared his throat to get attention. "From far away, brother?" he asked, his voice hoarse from cigarettes and years of driving trucks across the desert. Chuck slowly nodded without speaking. But that was enough to make the old driver smile with satisfaction. At least the stranger wasn't so unfriendly that he wouldn't nod. "I'm Harvey," the driver introduced himself. "Been traveling this road for more than 40 years. Know every corner from Albuquerque to Phoenix. A clever way to ask where Chuck had come from. But Chuck just nodded again, his eyes still looking out the window. Robin stood there, ears occasionally twitching at strange sounds. Outside, Robin sneezed softly, then shook its head as if greeting the evening. The wind continued to blow. The sun kept sinking. And Dust Creek seemed destined for a peaceful evening. But peace is sometimes just a thin layer of dust, covering a storm silently forming in the distance. Part 2. Secrets of the Valley. The desert wind blew stronger, creating whistling sounds through the old window frames of the rusted spur. These winds carried history, fragments of stories from the land, and sometimes warnings. Chuck took another sip of coffee, enjoying the calm before the storm. Not just a weather storm, but the tempest about to break in the quiet life of this small town. While Chuck sat watching, the diner door opened again. A tall man entered, his gait powerful yet cautious, eyes quickly scanning the entire room, pausing briefly when they found Chuck. This was Sheriff Michael Johnson, Dust Creek's keeper of order for the past 15 years. "Lizzie, coffee as usual," he said in a deep, raspy voice, then sat on a stool near the bar. His brass sheriff's badge gleamed under the oil lamp light, a .45 pistol holstered at his hip, not to flaunt authority, but as a necessary tool for his job. Lizzie poured the coffee and placed it before the sheriff, along with a small slice of apple pie, the daily privilege of the man who ensured the town's security. "Something wrong, Mike?" she asked, noticing the tension on his face. Sheriff Johnson sighed, weary eyes looking down at his coffee cup. "Looks like the Scorpions are heading our way. Just got word from Junction City. They caused trouble there last night." The name of the Scorpions' motorcycle gang was enough to make the atmosphere in the diner heavy. Everyone knew these weren't weekend riders. The Scorpions were an infamous gang known for causing trouble, robbing, and sometimes leaving bodies in their wake. Sam Williams put down his newspaper, looking directly at the sheriff. "How many of them?" "About a dozen," Johnson replied. "Led by Rattlesnake Rick, ex-con from Nevada State Prison, released 6 months ago. FBI's tracking him, but they don't have enough evidence to arrest him again." Chuck remained silent, but his eyes under the cowboy hat brim narrowed. He had heard about Rattlesnake Rick, a bloodthirsty man with the ability to strike as quickly as a desert rattlesnake, a man who wouldn't hesitate to kill for twisted pleasure. "How many guns do we have, Mike?" Harvey, the truck driver, asked, his voice dropping. "Not enough." Johnson shook his head. "I only have 2 deputies. One's on leave, and the other broke his leg last week. I've called for backup from the county, but they'll take 3 hours to get here." Lizzie looked out the window, worry evident on her face. "What will they do here? Our town has nothing worth stealing." "The town doesn't, but people do," Sam said firmly. "My father used to say Dust Creek is an ideal stopping point. Far enough to hide, small enough not to be noticed." Johnson nodded. "And rumor has it that Rattlesnake is looking for something. Something supposedly buried somewhere near Dust Creek." "Treasure?" Harvey raised an eyebrow. "We've heard this story 100 times. There's no treasure." Johnson sipped his coffee. "Not gold or silver. According to my source, in 1978, there was a major heist in Las Vegas. Several $1 million disappeared. The robbers were never caught, but rumor has it that one of them hid out in Dust Creek and buried the money somewhere in the valley." "And Rick believes that?" Sam asked, skeptical. He doesn't just believe it, Johnson answered. From what I know, Rick's father was one of those robbers, and before he died in prison last year, he left something for Rick, probably a clue about where the money is. Chuck slowly put his coffee cup down. He knew how these stories ended, not with laughter and celebration. From the distance, a faint sound echoed. Motorcycle engines, still far away but approaching. A glance out the window, Chuck saw Robin with head raised high, ears perked up, a sign of alertness. "They're coming," Johnson said, standing up, his hand resting on his gun. Sam stood too, instinctively. "I have a Winchester in my truck. Let me get it." Johnson nodded. "Lizzie, lock the back door and turn off some lights. Harvey, take everyone else to the back room." "How can I help?" Chuck spoke for the first time, his voice as warm and deep as desert sand. Everyone turned to look at him, surprised that the stranger had finally spoken. Johnson observed Chuck for a moment, his eyes assessing. "Do you know how to handle a gun, mister?" "Norris, Chuck Norris," he replied. "And yes, I can help in my way." A moment of hesitation crossed Johnson's face, but the approaching engine sounds left him with few options. "All right, Mr. Norris, we need all the help we can get." Chuck stood up and walked to the door. "I'll be outside with Robin." "Robin?" Sam asked. "My horse," Chuck answered briefly, then stepped outside, leaving behind puzzled looks. The sky had turned deep purple, the first stars appearing on the desert horizon. The air carried the chill of the desert night, but Chuck knew tonight would be anything but cold. Part 3. Wolves in the Shadows. Darkness fell quickly, as if the sun knew something was about to happen and didn't want to witness it. The oil lamps in the rusted spur flickered in the wind, casting shadows on the walls like silent ghosts. Outside, the main street was bathed in a misty blue-gray light. All that remained were the sounds of the wind and something else. Chuck stood on the diner's porch, his tall figure forming a silent, dark silhouette in the night. Robin stood nearby, no longer tied to the wooden post. Chuck knew that in dangerous situations, a horse needed freedom to react quickly. Sheriff Johnson stepped out to stand beside Chuck, his pistol loaded and ready in its holster. Sam Williams joined them, holding the old Winchester, a legacy from his father, a gun that had seen many battles. "You don't have a weapon, Norris?" Johnson asked, his voice tinged with concern. Chuck just smiled slightly. "I have what I need." From the distance, a low rumble sounded, then more joined in harmony. The sound built like rolling waves, like predators approaching. The motorcycle engines echoed into the night, shattering Dust Creek's peaceful silence like a knife tearing through still water. Chuck Norris didn't raise his head, but his eyes under the cowboy hat brim narrowed slightly. Outside, a pack of motorcycles raced into town like wolves into a sheepfold. There were about 12 of them, headlights illuminating the dusty road, exhaust pipes roaring as if challenging the heavens. They entered the town like a pack of hunting wolves, strategic, coordinated. Each motorcycle carried 2 people, a driver and a weapon-wielding passenger. Each carried something, from baseball bats wrapped in barbed wire to daggers to small hunting rifles. And on the backs of their leather jackets is the symbol of a red scorpion, the identifying mark of the Scorpions gang. This gang wasn't the tourist type, worn leather jackets, skull tattoos, arrogant eyes. They laughed loudly, roared, pushed gates and banged on doors. In front of the rusted spur, they stopped, and immediately One of them noticed Robin. The leader, taller than the rest, muscles rippling beneath his black leather jacket, was Rattlesnake Rick. He removed his helmet, revealing a rugged face with a long scar running from the temple to the chin. His long black hair was tied in a ponytail, his black, coal-like beard was thick, and his cold blue eyes swept over the diner, then settled on Chuck Norris. On his left arm was a tattoo of a rattlesnake in striking position, the personal emblem that had earned him his nickname. Whose horse is that? Who brings an antique out in the age of motorcycles? Rick spoke, his voice hoarse from cigarettes and whiskey, then burst into laughter. His yellowed teeth and single gold tooth gleaming in the moonlight made his smile even more grotesque. No one in the diner answered. Everyone sat still, eyes silently looking toward the window. They knew someone was about to make a big mistake. From inside the diner, Lizzie watched through a crack in the door, her heart racing. She saw Rick sitting on a glossy black Harley-Davidson with red flames painted along its body, a shotgun holstered on the side of the bike like a warning to anyone who dared oppose them. The others dismounted too, weapons in hand, the sound of laughter and profanity echoing in Dust Creek's still air. They brought with them the smell of gasoline, sweat, and violence from lawless highways. Sheriff Johnson, hand on his gun holster, stepped onto the porch facing Rick. Sam stood behind him, gripping the Winchester tightly. "Good evening, Rick," Johnson began, his voice surprisingly calm. "I didn't think Dust Creek was on your itinerary." Rick smirked, contempt evident. "You're right, old cop. This is an unexpected visit. We have business here. Private business." "There's no private business in my town," Johnson replied firmly. "If you want to rest, have a drink and move on. I have no problem with that. But if you're looking for trouble, I suggest you go elsewhere." Rick laughed loudly, and the gang joined in. "Are you threatening us, old man?" "With what? You and the kid with that toy gun?" Johnson didn't flinch. Not a threat, just sincere advice. While the tense dialogue continued, Rick's eyes wandered and saw Robin standing near the hitching post. His eyes flashed, a cruel idea forming in his mind. He walked over and, without warning, kicked Robin hard in the flank. The warhorse jerked, raising its head, pulling at the rope, wild eyes flaring like the first fire in the night. Robin wasn't easily frightened. It had crossed steep mountain slopes and desert sandstorms. It merely turned, looking at its attacker with as much contempt as its owner might show. In the diner, Chuck put down his coffee cup. Not fast, not slow. Careful, as if he were about to rise from a chess table. An unusual stillness enveloped him, like the calm before thunder strikes across the desert sky. The wooden floor creaked as he stood up, adjusted his hat brim, and walked to the door. The wind blew a little stronger, as if welcoming the change in the air. The motorcycles were still parked in a row, Robin still standing there, its side trembling slightly but not backing down. Chuck descended the porch steps, 4 old wooden stairs groaning under his weight. Sheriff Johnson and Sam instinctively stepped back as if making room for something about to happen. Rick looked Chuck up and down with contempt. An old man with an outdated cowboy hat was, in his eyes, just a pathetic joke of the desert. "Your horse?" Rick asked mockingly, his lips curling into a scornful smile. Chuck replied with just one sentence, soft as a breeze but carrying the weight of a punch. "Stay away from my horse." The entire gang burst into laughter. One laughed loudly, another gripped the dagger tucked in his belt. In their eyes, Chuck Norris was just a senile old man who needed to be taught a lesson about street power. "What? I didn't hear you, old man," Rick said, deliberately putting his ear closer. "Can you speak up?" Chuck didn't repeat himself. He just stood there, silent, his deep blue eyes staring straight into Rick's as if looking through his soul. And then, as if challenged by that silence, the leader kicked Robin a second time, harder. "Hey, old man, is your horse as mute as its owner?" Rick laughed loudly, turning to look at his gang for approval. That was the point of no return. Chuck wasn't angry, didn't shout, just stepped forward, each step solid and certain. The atmosphere grew thick like before a great storm. 4 meters, 3 meters, 2 meters. The distance between him and Rick was narrowing. "Stop!" Rick snapped, instinct warning of danger. He reached behind where a handgun was tucked into his belt, but it was too late. Then he made his move. Part 4. The Storm from the West. Everything happened so fast that almost no one had time to register it. A body pivot, a precise punch to the chest. The leader flew backward like a sack of hay hit by a hammer. The dull thud of the punch echoed in Dust Creek's still air. Rick staggered, his chest feeling like it had been hit by a sledgehammer. He gasped for breath, trying to regain his balance, but his eyes had lost their initial arrogance, replaced by surprise mixed with fear. "Damn, old man," one of the gang members roared, pulling out a dagger and charging toward Chuck. But Chuck moved like water, fluid, flexible, and elusive. He leaned to the side, easily avoiding the blade, then grabbed the thug's wrist and twisted it slightly. The sound of a wrist bone breaking rang out. The knife fell to the ground and the thug collapsed, screaming in pain. Another one rushed in. Chuck blocked the attack, his hand rotating, using the opponent's force to flip him to the ground. The heavy body of the thug slammed into the dusty ground, and it forced from his lungs in a painful groan. Two attacked simultaneously, one from the left, one from the right. Chuck didn't flinch. He had faced this situation hundreds of times before, in the arid deserts of Iraq, in the humid forests of South America, and the dark alleys of Saigon in the 70s. A body turn, a precise kick to the left knee, followed by a straight punch to the right jaw. Both collapsed simultaneously, like puppets with cut strings. Not a wasted motion. Not an unnecessary movement. Chuck fought like a man who had learned martial arts from the silence of the wind and the patience of the desert. Sheriff Johnson stood frozen, gun still holstered, unable to believe his eyes. Sam Williams's jaw dropped, the Winchester nearly falling from his grasp. In the diner, Lizzie clutched her cloth tightly, mouth agape. The old truck driver whispered, "My God, he's the real deal." Rattlesnake Rick, having regained his balance, pulled out his handgun, but Chuck was already right in front of him, fast as a desert wind. With a punch to the wrist, the gun dropped to the ground, followed by a low sweep of Rick's legs. The gang leader fell face first into the road dust, blood flowing from his nose. His aggression completely vanished. The remaining gang members stood still, no one daring to move. They had witnessed the impossible. An old cowboy taking down 5 of their gang in a matter of seconds without using any weapons. The last one, a young-faced kid, started to draw a knife but then stopped. Chuck's eyes looked at him as if peering directly into his conscience. That's the feeling of helplessness, Chuck said, his voice deep and firm. That statement wasn't just for the man at his feet, but for the whole town, for anyone who ever thought the power came from noise. Chuck turned, looking at the remaining thugs. You have two choices. Pick up your buddies and leave, or stay and end up like them. No reply came, only the sound of the desert wind blowing through the quiet town. One of the gang members, older than the rest, stepped forward and asked one simple question. Who are you? Chuck looked at him without blinking. That's not what matters. What matters is that you know what to do now. The beaten leader, breathing heavily, eyes bloodshot, but no longer daring to fight back. Ground, dust, hands pressed down, and silence enveloping everything. Rick tried to stand up, staggering, blood still flowing from his nose onto his shiny black leather jacket. We have business in this town, Rick said, his voice no longer carrying its initial arrogance. My father, he buried something here. Chuck didn't look surprised. He had heard stories like this before. Sons searching for their father's treasures, secrets buried under the sands of time. That treasure isn't worth trading your life for, Chuck said calmly. Rick shook his head, suddenly laughing bitterly. You don't understand. It's not money. It's... But before Rick could finish his sentence, a gunshot rang out, tearing through the still air. Rick fell, a bloodstain spreading across his chest. Everyone turned, and from the shadows at the edge of town, a figure emerged. Old Joe, Sheriff Johnson exclaimed, recognizing the shooter. Joe Miller, the owner of an old mine on the outskirts of town, who had lived in seclusion for 40 years. Joe, with silver-gray hair and a face deeply marked with wrinkles, held an antique gun that was still smoking. No one should find it. No one. Chuck understood immediately. Joe wasn't just an old man. He was one of the robbers from 1978, the one who had buried the secret in Dust Creek and lived in isolation to protect it. Why? Chuck asked. Not about shooting Rick, but about the treasure. Why is it so important? Joe looked at Chuck, his aged eyes having seen too many of life's upheavals. Because it's not money. It's evidence. Evidence about the Kennedy assassination. A collective gasp rose from everyone present. Sam Williams shook his head in disbelief. Sheriff Johnson stood stunned, and Chuck Norris, the man who had seen too many of this world's secrets, just nodded gently, as if he had known all along. That's why it must never be found, Joe said, voice trembling. I've kept it secret all these years, until my prison mate, Rick's father, decided to reveal it to his son. Rick lay on the ground, still bleeding but alive. You killed my father in prison, didn't you? Joe shook his head. No, boy. It was the people who don't want the truth revealed who did that, and they'll come here as soon as they know you're looking for it. Chuck stepped forward, standing between Joe and Rick. Enough. No more bloodshed. Joe looked at Chuck as if recognizing the man for the first time. You, Chuck Norris. I know you. You used to work for them. Chuck didn't deny it. I've done many things for many people, but now I only follow my conscience. Joe lowered his gun. What will you do with this secret? Chuck looked at Joe, then at the wounded Rick, then turned to Sheriff Johnson and the Dust Creek townspeople who had gathered to watch. The truth deserves to be revealed, but not through blood. Not here, not today. Part 5. The Value of Truth. The morning light illuminated Dust Creek with its first golden rays, warm yellow against the deep blue sky. The night had passed, taking its secrets with it. Rick had been taken to Dr. Carter's small clinic, the town's only physician. The bullet had been removed, and despite the blood loss, Rick would live. The Scorpions' gang members had been temporarily detained in the town's small jail by the sheriff. Joe had voluntarily surrendered and told the whole story. About the 1978 heist, not a robbery of money, but of a box containing documents and a film reel from a secret office in Las Vegas. About how these documents contained evidence of a conspiracy behind Kennedy's assassination, and about how he had buried it somewhere in Dust Creek Valley. Chuck Norris stood on the porch of the Rusted Spur, drinking his final cup of coffee before departure. Robin had been fed and rested, ready for the next stage of their journey. Lizzie came out, standing beside Chuck. "You're going to find it, aren't you? The evidence Joe talked about." Chuck gazed into the distance toward the western hills, where the sun was rising higher. "Joe told me where it's buried, but I'm not sure if the world is ready for that truth yet." "What will you do with it?" Lizzie asked, curious. Chuck smiled slightly. "Make sure it's kept safe, until the right time." Sheriff Johnson and Sam also approached, along with almost all of Dust Creek's residents. They came not to stop Chuck, but to thank him, the man who had helped their small town avoid a bloodier night. "You're always welcome in Dust Creek, Mr. Norris," Johnson said sincerely. Chuck nodded, grateful. He descended the steps, moving toward Robin. The horse whinnied softly at the sight of its master, as if understanding it was time to move on. Chuck mounted, adjusted his hat, and looked down at the small crowd that had gathered to see him off. "Will you come back?" Lizzie asked, her voice full of hope. "The West is vast," Chuck replied, "but roads always lead people back to where they need to be." Then he gently nudged Robin, and the horse began to move, first slowly, then faster. The silhouette of the rider and horse gradually diminished against the horizon, blending into the brilliant desert dawn. From the edge of town, a small boy watched the receding figure and asked his mother, "Mom, is that man Superman?" The mother didn't answer right away. She watched Chuck Norris's figure slowly disappearing into the brilliant horizon, then smiled softly. "No, son. He's something beyond Superman. He's a real man in a world that has forgotten what that means." And as Dust Creek Town gradually returned to its normal rhythm, Chuck Norris galloped toward the western hills. In his jacket pocket was the map Joe had drawn, directions to a secret that could change history. But that's a story for another day. The desert wind blew again, carrying echoes of the past and whispers of the future. And in that wind, a promise could be heard, that Chuck Norris would return when Dust Creek and the world needed him most. Robin's hoofbeats had disappeared behind the hills, but the story of the man who single-handedly faced the entire Scorpions gang would be told forever in this small town. For in the world of frontier towns, where the wind blows and the desert stretches endlessly, nothing is more precious than legends of real men. Those who know how to stand up for what is right, regardless of the price to be paid.